Oh, God. Yeah, you're probably wondering where I've been. Well, I've been doing, nothing in particular. I mean, yeah, I've been playing Persona 5 with pretty much any free time I've had in the last while, but of course I have been. It's a game that can last you up to hundreds of hours if you go through the New Game Plus mode and take your sweet-ass time with it, which I obviously am. And also, I've just been completely enraptured by Persona 5's story, its two-tone gameplay, and most importantly, its characters. So, yeah, that's what I've been up to. And I realize it's been a while. How are you doing? How's school? Are you passing all your grades? What about your cat? Did they get their leg issue sorted out? So yeah, I'm gonna talk about Persona 5 today. If you're completely out of the loop on what I'm talking about, I'll give you a quick rundown of what this series is before you go and remedy that lapse in memory for yourself. Persona is a series of RPGs developed by Atlus. Originally, they were a series of spin-off games based on Atlus's other series, Shin Megami Tensei, but since Persona's debut 20 years ago in 1996, the series has taken on a life of its own, becoming its own franchise and definitely surpassing the popularity of Shin Megami Tensei, at least in North America. Okay, so what is Persona about? Basically, the core idea is that you're a high school student somewhere in Japan, and through some way or another, you're granted the ability to enter people's subconscious and do a multitude of things. Whether it's make people accept uncomfortable truths about themselves, or make criminals confess their most guarded crimes, depending on the game. And you generally do this by battling their inner demons. Like, literally, with punches and kicks and magic and stuff. But the more important aspect of the game is that your strength in battle is all about the treasure you gain, and that treasure is the friendships you build along the way. And also sometimes it's literal treasure. The game is half dungeon crawling, half Pokemon, and half time management sim, and yes, I know that's more than two halves, please don't smother me with your science! But I'm not actually going to be talking all that in depth about the history or plot of Persona 5. If you want that, check out this video I helped out with on the leaderboard where I do talk all that in depth about the history and plot of Persona 5. Also, go play the Persona games. Pause this video for 1,000 hours, go buy and play them, and then come back. You don't even need to play them in order, they have nothing to do with each other, so you have no excuse, damn it. Instead, today I want to focus primarily on its setting, its characters, and why it resonates with me so much. Persona's setting and story fits into a genre called urban fantasy, or more specifically, contemporary fantasy. Though you could also make the argument that Persona is actually part of the magical realism genre, or a combination of a bunch of different things, but I'm not really here to argue semantics today. So for the purposes of this video, we'll just say that Persona is part of the contemporary fantasy genre. So what contemporary fantasy means is that the story setting takes place in the real-world present day that work was published in, as opposed to some sort of alternate history or distant past or future. The part that makes it fantasy is that some supernatural elements or parallel world are sort of thrust upon the otherwise normal and urban setting. Think of a series like Harry Potter that takes place in our own world but also has its own parallel wizard world that has its own stuff going on that is completely unknown to the Muggles. This is as opposed to something like high fantasy where the work takes place in a completely fictional setting with fictional races and fictional everything, like Lord of the Rings. And while there are plenty of books and movies and TV shows that have this sort of setting, games don't really share a similar statistic. In fact, apart from the Persona series, I really have to strain to think of more than a couple of games that relish in this sort of contemporary fantasy setting. And I took a good hard look at this recently, and I noticed that a lot of the games I find myself getting into, like really into, share this commonality. Let's take a look at some of them to get an idea of what I mean. Obviously, we have the Persona series, which takes place in modern-day Japan and has the protagonist forming a ragtag group of outcasts to venture inside people's subconscious. There's the Ace Attorney series, in which you play a defense lawyer in modern-day Japan trying to do right by his badge among the strangest cases ever, usually involving some kind of magic. Also, the legal system is totally weird. There's Life is Strange, the story of a girl in high school who inexplicably finds herself possessing the ability to reverse time. From there, the main focus of the game deals with a plot of intrigue, as well as determining what constitutes a responsible use of these powers. Say what you will about David Cage and his repertoire of weird, but even if I find myself wanting to ironically enjoy one of his romps through the fantastical modern day, like Beyond Two Souls or the less fantastical Heavy Rain, Jason! I always find myself getting legitimately invested in Mr. Cage's wild ride. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to the release of Detroit destroy it, thanks for asking. Another game I played through recently was Atlas's Catherine, which has you juggling the pressures of your subconscious attempting to do you in through your dreams as a result of you trying to juggle two relationships at once in the waking world. And there are also games I haven't played yet but I'm strongly interested in. And right now, that game is Night in the Woods. Now, I don't know much about this game, and that's on purpose, but from what I've heard, it's about a girl who drops out of college and returns home only to realize that Thomas Wolfe may have been onto something when he said you can't go home again. And also there's some sort of plot of intrigue or something. The important thing to note is that that initial description I gave of Night in the Woods sounds like a totally enthralling game to me. And these are all games that do something for me that most others can't, and I really think it's because they all share a relatively modern and urban or sometimes suburban setting, so why do I find myself more drawn to this kind of setting? So over the years I've realized an uncomfortable truth of my own, and it's not one that I can admit easily since I'm, you know, a nerd. But I've never really been someone who's super into lore. Unless I'm putting in a conscious effort, the one thing you can do to drive me away from something is insist I read some sort of compendium in order to enjoy my story, so I tend to stray away from the stuff you need to really dig deep into in order to enjoy. Either that or it will take me more than a couple of tries to get into it. And I seem to have this problem, especially when it comes to high fantasy, like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. That's not to say I actively hate these things, though. I've been known to indulge in some D&D. I'm hip with the kids. I know what they're into. At worst, when it comes to high fantasy, I'll generally have no opinion of it. But I've never been one to want to memorize the names of a bunch of new kings or anything to enjoy the context of my story. All the mystic babble tends to blend together for me, and I find myself mixing up fantasy worlds all the time. I've confused the worlds of Dragon Age and The Witcher with each other far more times than I care to admit. But the games I listed earlier in this video don't really have this problem. They don't really require any sort of initial investment from their player to learn about the world since the game takes place in our own world. The amount of contextual info you have is directly proportional to how much you know about where in the real world the game is supposed to take place, and this makes it easier for me to pick up, play, and get invested. This is especially true in Persona, where the games aren't particularly connected and any fantastical elements are introduced early on, and Igor is basically like, hey, yo, shit's gonna get weird, but don't think about it too much though. I'll explain later. Cool? Now, you could claim that because I'm not willing to lend my brainpower to imagining these vast epic worlds that I have no imagination, but counterpoint, whenever I do something, I'm able to picture the absolute worst-case scenario of every situation. And because of that, I'm able to protect myself from the riskier elements of life, like, you know, going outside, so I think it's safe to say that my imagination is just fine. Some people ideally view games as inherent challenges. I've heard some say that the story of a game should be seen as a reward that the player works for, whether it comes in the form of cutscenes, story hidden in the flavor text of items, or long-winded YouTube videos about how mechanics should always exist to serve the story. And while these all definitely have their place, the only thing that concerns me with the delivery as it relates to me is whether or not I can digest it, and that comes down entirely to personal preference. And I tend to just prefer the narrative shorthand that our own real world is able to provide us within a game. Also, a particularly large portion of these games seem to focus on one key element way more than a lot of other games. Games that focus on a modern-day environment, regardless of whatever fantastical nonsense is going on in the background, more often implement some sort of pressure to balance these wacky goings-on with day-to-day life, which obviously makes the game easier for me to relate to since I have to balance day-to-day life with literally everything I do. I don't do a good job at it, but by God, I try. So this section, and basically the rest of this video, is pretty much what drove me to want to talk about this in the first place. I've also found that a lot of the games I gravitate towards, these games that have this sort of urban fantasy setting, are frequently the same kinds of stories, especially Persona, which is why I felt it was necessary to explain the series earlier. A lot of these games are coming-of-age stories in their own right. In Persona particularly, the basic premise of the game is usually the same. You play as a high school transfer student who's gifted the supernatural powers of entering a parallel world, yes, but you spend just as much time just interacting with your new friends. And in each game, the bonds you form not just with your party members, but everyone around town are essential in reaching the end of the game's story, much like how a robust support system is needed for basically anyone who wants to make it through this crazy dance we call life. And in a way, Persona makes me take a good hard look at myself and who I am as a person. Not just as I perceive myself, but as to how my friends perceive me too. And as someone who has a relatively small network of close friends, Persona makes me feel like I could do so much more than what I'm actually doing. Basically, all of these games, but especially Persona, allow me to re-examine the events of my own life through another lens and recontextualize them in a way I might not have considered otherwise. Persona 5 in particular excels at this ability to allow me to recontextualize because, as the last title just told you, the protagonist is much more than just his role in the story. The first game I played in this series was Persona 4. I haven't quite gotten around to playing 3 yet, but it's sitting on my shelf in its original packaging, so I'll get to it soon. And while I love Persona 4 dearly, the protagonist wasn't exactly the most well-rounded character. Whenever a social link increased, they may as well have just shown text saying, "That's you, you're doing that." Oh wait, I guess they kinda did do that. But Persona 5 builds on this idea, and while you definitely create your own person, choosing dialogue options and being exactly as much of a sarcastic asshole as you want to be, I would argue that the protagonist isn't quite the blank slate that was advertised to us. In Persona 4, you're the new transfer student because your parents work overseas, and also you have some new powers or something. Cool. But in Persona 5, you were falsely convicted of an assault and are out to both clear your own name and help the less fortunate while trying to fly under the radar since you're still on probation. Also, you're kind of a flippin' dickhead no matter what. Now, I haven't reached the end of Persona 5, so I don't know how all of this plays out. But both of those descriptions are what you're working with through the majority of both games, respectively. Independently of the player, one game's protagonist's lights are on, but nobody's home, while the other feels like a fleshed-out character in their own right. And this is heavily helped by small things, like having them have their own splash screen during all-out attacks and other similarities shared between all cast members. Furthermore, the protagonist of Persona 5 is voiced. Maybe not as much as we're used to other protagonists being voiced, but his voice is definitely much more present than those of other Persona protagonists. I mean, yeah, 4s would whisper the name of their persona every now and then, but 5 says stuff like, all the time. For the majority of the game, it's small, innocuous stuff like when you're saving or the odd line in an anime cutscene, but it's still there. He is, to a degree, more than just your vessel. He is his own character. But because you're able to project yourself onto him by selecting his dialogue and such, he gives off the impression of being exactly as rounded as the rest of the supporting cast. Only the player is filling in the protagonist's gaps based on themselves instead of defining the entire character by themselves. In a sense, Persona 5's protagonist is more than 4's, and I assume 3's, because more than just a vessel, the protagonist is the player's idealized version of themselves. Prophesies to do great things or save the world in one way or another, yes, but more importantly, always supportive and there for the small army of friends he makes within the span of a year. In a way, the personas that Persona 5's protagonist wields are not just the in-game monsters, or the different personalities that the game encourages they adopt depending on who they socialize with in the real world, but also those of every single person that plays this game. But it doesn't just stop with Persona 5's protagonist. In each game in the series, each individual player's experience of not just the protagonist, but also the supporting cast is radically different. The grounded, realistic struggles of some of these characters, especially in 4 and 5, that other games don't cover all that often, like revelations about sexual orientation, feelings of inadequacy, and incredibly hard to talk about issues like emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, the emotional impacts these characters may deliver are what makes a series like Persona a deeply intimate experience and one where each player's playthrough of the game is singularly theirs. My Persona 5 protagonist is equal parts Atlas and myself, just as yours is equal parts Atlas and you. I am not thou, thou art Persona. I'm not going to apologize if this video came off as rambling or meandering. Persona is a game series that is especially close to my heart. Everyone has their game that helped them through a particularly hard time. I've heard anecdotes from people who have experienced dark times and how certain games like Fallout New Vegas or Morrowind were there to accompany them through their worst days. And for me, that game was Persona 4. In my early 20s, I went through a particularly bad period where I was practically unemployed, I was out of money, I had dropped out of college, I was super depressed, and I was totally unsure of my direction in life. And while I did have a supportive roommate, I still found myself retreating into my own shell and shutting myself away from others. And this also just happened to be the time where, through that supportive roommate, I discovered Persona 4. The game, along with being f***ing phenomenal, also helped give me the courage to finally admit some uncomfortable truths about my own life, much like the characters in the game. In my case, it's that I was stuck, that I needed a change. It helped me realize I needed to actually take those terrifying steps instead of just feeling stuck all the time. Now, 5 years later, as much as I don't want to admit it, I found myself stuck in a similar rut, seeing countless Facebook posts about people having babies and getting engaged and, living adult lives, while I'm still at heart that lonely, scared 20-year-old, not knowing what the next steps are. And sure enough, Persona 5 has kicked down my door and forced me to face these problems head-on through things as deceptively simple as its grounded setting and idealized main character. Now all I can do is hope I've learned my lesson and take these responsibilities head-on. And if I don't, Well, maybe the third time will be a charm if a Persona 6 is ever released.
You're not surprised.